Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into what looks, on the surface anyway, like a really inspiring global success story.
That's right. We're talking about water and sanitation access.
Exactly. In recent decades, literally billions of people gained access to improved drinking water and sanitation. A lot of that driven by big global pushes like the Millennium Development Goals.
It is remarkable progress, truly. But here's the twist, isn't it? Does that overall global number mean access is equitable for everyone?
Right. That's the key question.
In the leaving no one behind idea from the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, really pushes us to look past just the averages.
Because those averages can hide a lot.
A huge amount. We need to see how different groups are doing.
So to really get at that, we're zooming in today. We're focusing this deep dive on Malawi.
A fascinating case study. As a least developed country, Malawi gives us a really vital perspective on these global trends and, crucially, where those inequalities are still lurking.
Our mission today is basically to unpack a really detailed research paper. It's called Trends in Access to Water and Sanitation in Malawi, Progress and Inequalities, 1992-2017.
Yeah, it covers a 25-year journey. We want to pull out the key lessons, understand the progress, sure, but also figure out who got left behind.
And what that means for actually achieving universal access down the line.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit. Global context, Malawi's starting point. First thing, maybe the most important. Access to safe water, basic sanitation, it's a human right.
Absolutely fundamental. And that recognition really fueled the efforts during the MDG era, the Millennium Development Goals.
Target 7C, right. Have the proportion without sustainable access by 2015.
Yep, and globally, the drinking water target was actually met, which, sounds fantastic.
Sounds like victory.
But if you dig in, the report notes that even then, 42.5% of the world still had to fetch water. It wasn't on their premises.
Okay, so access had limitations.
Big ones. And sanitation. That target was missed completely. In 2015, you still had 13% of the world practicing open defecation.
13% globally, wow.
And get this, 9 out of 10 of those people lived in rural areas. So that global success story, it kind of papered over the cracks for a lot of people.
So the MDGs showed progress was possible, but also highlighted some real blind spots. How did the SDGs learn from that?
They really did seem to take those lessons seriously. The SDGs run to 2030, and there's a much, much stronger focus on equitable, universal access.
Equitable, right.
And specifically, ending open defecation for all, with special attention, importantly, to women, girls, and vulnerable groups.
And they changed how they measure it too, didn't they? These safely managed indicators.
Yes, exactly. Much tougher definitions.
So what does safely managed actually mean?
For water, it means it's got to be on your premises, available when you need it, and free from contamination.
Okay, that's a high bar.
It is. And for sanitation, it means improved facilities, but not shared with other households. And crucially, the waste has to be safely disposed of.
Right, not just contained.
Not just contained. And this stricter definition, well, it kind of lowered the baseline numbers globally.
How so?
Well, for example, under the SDG definition, only 71% of the global population had safely managed drinking water at the start. That's a much more sobering picture than the old MDG figures suggested.
So, bringing it to Malawi specifically, what was their situation around 2015, just before these SDG measures really kicked in?
Okay, so Malawi in 2015, 87% had access to an improved water source. That's the older definition. And 41% had access to an improved sanitation facility.
87 and 41%.
But the source we're looking at raises a really important flag here. It suggests these numbers might have been, and I'm quoting, driven by the progress made in areas that did not have the greatest need.
The low-hanging fruit problem. Basically, sorting out the easier areas first might have inflated the overall progress while leaving the hardest to reach behind.
Precisely. That's the concern.
And you mentioned data gaps for Malawi, too. They don't really know the safely managed picture yet.
That's right. Key information, like water quality details, contamination levels, it's just not consistently available for Malawi. So the true safely managed status is largely unknown.
Okay, so given all that complexity, what exactly did this study set out to do? What was the core question?
The main goal was twofold. First, describe the trends over that 25-year period, 1992 to 2017. How did access change?
Okay, track the progress.
And second, using that data, identify the most vulnerable groups. Who is still being left behind in Malawi?
And how did they go about that? What data did they use?
They pulled together data from several large-scale harmonized household surveys. You've got the UNICEF MIASIS
And it's
survey.
full indicator cluster surveys, right?
Yep. Then the USAA Demographic and Health Surveys, the DHS ones.
Very well known.
And also malaria indicator surveys, which are linked to DHS. Basically, they combine these major household survey programs.
Sounds like a mountain of data. How big a sample are we talking?
It was substantial. They analyzed data from 154,603 Malawian households across that 25-year span.
Wow. And what specific things were they measuring consistently across all those different surveys?
To keep things comparable, they focused on two main indicators. First, the share of people without access to an improved water source within 30 minutes round trip. They call this lacking basic access.
Okay, basic water access. And the second?
The proportion of the population practicing open defecation, OD.
Got it. So basic water and OD. And how did they slice and dice this data to see the inequalities? Because national averages, as we said.
Right, they don't tell the full story, so they disaggregated. They looked at differences by geographic region. Malawi's got northern, central, and southern regions.
Okay.
Urban versus rural areas, obviously a huge divide.
Always key.
Then by wealth, they used wealth quintiles. Basically divided the population into 5 equal groups from poorest to richest.
So you can see if poverty is the main driver.
Exactly. And finally, by the education level of the household, had no education, primary, secondary, or higher.
Okay, that's a pretty detailed breakdown. So armed with all that, what did the 25 years of data actually show? What were the big findings on progress and inequality?
Well, nationally, the progress really is quite something. For drinking water, the percentage of people without basic access dropped massively, from 57% in 1992 down to 22% in 2017.
57 down to 22. That's a huge reduction.
It's a 62% reduction. That translates to millions of people in Malawi getting better water access, a real testament to the efforts made.
That's fantastic. But you mentioned a gender dimension earlier.
Yes. Here's a stark point. While access improved, the burden of fetching that water didn't really shift. The proportion of women doing the water collection stayed stubbornly high, around 84 to 87% between 2006 and 2014.
So better access, but the same people, mainly women, are still doing the hard work. What about open defecation?
Even more dramatic progress there, nationally speaking. OD dropped from 25% of the population in 1992 to just 6% in 2017.
25 down to 6%. That's incredible.
It's a reduction of over 75%. Really significant public health gain.
Definitely.
And if you look at the people who lacked both basic water and practiced OD, the absolute most vulnerable group, their share fell by nearly 90%, from 16% down to 2% nationally.
Wow, 90% reduction for that group. That really does suggest the interventions were reaching the furthest behind, doesn't it?
It strongly suggests that, yes, which is a very positive sign.
Okay, so the national picture is impressive progress, but now let's use that disaggregated data. What about rural versus urban? Big differences there.
Oh, yeah. Rural areas, remember, that's where 83% of Malawians live. They saw the biggest absolute improvement in water access.
Meaning the percentage point drop was largest.
Exactly. A 38 percentage point decrease in people without access, bringing the rural figure down to 25% lacking access in 2017.
Still quite high, 25%, but a huge improvement.
Huge improvement. Urban areas started much better off. Only 13% lacked access back in 92. They improved too, down to 5% by 2017, so their percentage change was faster. But the gap
between urban and rural is still pretty significant.
It remains significant, yes. Urban areas started ahead and largely stayed ahead.
And for open defecation, did the gap narrow there?
It did, considerably. Back in 92, rural OD was 28%, urban was just 2%. A massive gap.
Huge difference.
By 2017, rural OD had dropped to 7% and urban was down to 1%. So great progress in rural areas narrowing that gap, but still, that urban advantage persists.
Okay. What about regionally? Did all three regions, north, central, south, see similar gains?
Not quite. The central and southern regions where most people live saw pretty similar substantial progress in water access, about a 37% reduction in lack of access in both.
Okay, good progress there.
The northern region, though, saw less progress. It went from 60% without basic water down to 31%. Still the highest proportion lacking access.
So the north is lagging on water. What about OD regionally?
Biggest gains in the central region, an 83% reduction in OD. Really impressive.
What?
The southern region, however, had lower progress on OD and still has the highest rate. So there seem to be some specific stubborn challenges in the south regarding sanitation.
Interesting. Okay, now let's look at wealth. Did getting richer automatically mean better access? And did the poor catch up at all?
This is actually one of the most positive findings, I think. The study found the poorest groups saw the biggest improvements in terms of percentage point reduction for water access.
Really? So the gap actually narrowed?
Yes, it narrowed the gap with the richer groups quite significantly. In fact, all wealth groups at least have the proportion of people without basic water access.
That's genuinely equitable progress then.
It looks like it. And for open defecation, similar story. Reduced by over 3/4 in most wealth groups. The gap between the poorest and richest narrowed here too.
Fantastic.
And it confirms that most people still lacking both water and sanitation were concentrated in rural areas and in the lower wealth quintiles. So just targeting was, broadly speaking, effective.
Okay, final breakdown. Education levels. Any surprises there?
This was fascinating, actually. And a bit counterintuitive for water access.
How so?
Well, as you'd expect, progress was seen for households where the head had no education or primary education. That fits the pattern of targeting the most vulnerable.
Right. Makes sense.
But paradoxically, the proportion without basic water access actually increased slightly for households with secondary or higher education.
Increase? How could that happen?
The study suggests this might be linked to urban, possibly unemployed populations with higher education who weren't the primary targets of many WASH-IT programs focused on rural or extremely poor areas.
Okay. So they might have fallen through the cracks of specific program designs. That's a really nuanced finding.
It really highlights where some of the starkest inequalities might lie, perhaps unexpectedly.
And OD by education, was that more straightforward?
Yes, that followed the expected pattern. OD reduced by about 3/4 for those with no education or primary education.
Okay. So this is incredibly rich data. But you mentioned limitations earlier. What do we need to keep in mind when we're looking at these trends?
Yeah, it's always important to be critical. The study itself points out a few things. One is that some of the ups and downs you see in the data, especially between 2010 and 2017, might be due to the type of survey used in a particular year.
So, like, a peak or a dip might be more about how they collected the data that year, not necessarily a sudden real-world change?
Exactly. Different surveys, like the DHS-MIS, had smaller sample sizes or slightly different ways of sampling, which can create noise in the trend line. You have to be careful not to overinterpret short-term fluctuations.
Got it. Survey methodology matters. What else?
Sampling bias is another one. Some surveys, particularly the DHS-MIS, tended to underestimate the proportion of the population living in rural areas compared to the census.
Okay.
And within the samples, urban areas sometimes overrepresented richer households, while rural samples might have underrepresented them, so the samples weren't perfectly reflected.
Right. And self-reporting, people telling surveyors what they think they want to hear.
Absolutely. That's always a potential issue with survey data, especially for sensitive topics like open defecation. Social desirability bias can creep in.
Makes sense.
And one final nuance. The definition of urban and rural isn't always clear-cut, especially with peri-urban areas or informal settlements.
The areas on the edge of cities.
Exactly. Were they consistently counted as urban or rural? It matters because back in 2013, estimates suggested nearly 70% of Malawi's urban population lived in these informal settlements. If they're missed or misclassified, it skews the urban picture significantly.
Okay, those are important caveats. So bearing those in mind, let's get back to the core mission. Identifying who was left behind. Using the 2015 data as a snapshot, who are the most vulnerable? Where should the focus be?
All right, for water access in 2015, the highest numbers of people without access were clearly in the rural, central, and southern regions.
Okay, rural, central, and south for water.
But here's an interesting wrinkle. In the rural northern areas, it was actually a higher percentage of the richer households who lacked basic access.
Richer households lacking access. That's unexpected.
It suggests that in some specific areas, the problem might be less about household poverty and more about, say, infrastructure availability or functionality affecting everyone in that location, even the better off.
Fascinating. Okay, what about open defecation in 2015? Who was still practicing OD?
Again, overwhelmingly concentrated in rural, central, and southern regions. Over half of all people practicing OD lived specifically in the rural south.
Rural south taking the brunt again.
And nearly 1/3 of those practicing OD were from the very poorest wealth quintile. In contrast, urban areas and the richest rural households had almost zero open defecation by 2015.
So a very clear picture for OD, rural, southern, and poor.
Extremely clear.
And if we combine the two, lacking basic water and practicing OD, the group facing the double burden?
The pattern becomes even sharper. More than half of the people lacking both services were in the rural southern region and predominantly from the poorest quintile.
Wow.
Urban areas, richer groups, basically 0 or near 0% lacking both by 2015.
So the study's conclusion on vulnerability is pretty stark then.
Absolutely. It hammers home that the poorest rural populations, particularly in the South, were the ones still facing the most severe limitations in both water access and sanitation.
Okay, so what does this all mean? What are the big takeaways, the so what for efforts moving forward?
Well, first, the positive. The fact that the biggest gains were often seen in the groups that started furthest behind really does suggest that overall, interventions were targeted relatively effectively.
That's encouraging. It shows targeting can work.
It really does, and this progress didn't happen in a vacuum. It links back to significant investment. Malawi actually received quite high per capita aid for the water sector in the 2000s.
Ah, so investment paid off.
It seems so. Plus, specific strategies like the Open Defecation-Free Malawi strategy from 2011, which explicitly focused on rural areas, likely play a big role too.
But the report also flags that the remaining few percent without access are probably the hardest to reach, right? The so-called last mile.
Exactly. Reaching them requires even more focused, perhaps different strategies. And while rural progress is key, this study and others really underline that we can't ignore vulnerable urban populations.
Especially in those peri-urban or informal settlements you mentioned.
Precisely. They can sometimes be even more vulnerable than rural populations, but get overlooked in programs designed for traditional rural poverty.
It also seems like the urban-rural divide in Malawi is, in some ways, an even stronger predictor of inequality than just wealth alone.
That often seems to be the case, yes. Geography matters immensely. And this brings us back to that crucial gender dimension we touched on.
Right. The fact that women are doing almost all the water fetching.
It's not just an inconvenience. Think about the hours lost every single day. That's time not spent on education, on income generation, on childcare, on healthcare.
Or just on rest.
Or just on rest. It directly impacts our opportunities and well-being. Plus, fetching water, often over long distances, exposes women and girls to risks of injury, harassment, even violence.
That's a heavy burden beyond just carrying the water. And open defecation impacts women and girls differently, too.
Hugely. Lack of a safe private toilet exposes them to risks of sexual harassment or assault, especially if they have to go out at night or in secluded areas. There's also significant psychosocial stress associated with the lack of dignity and privacy.
So improving water, sanitation, hygiene isn't just about health. It's fundamentally about gender equality, too.
Absolutely. It's a key driver for improving the lives of women and girls. Interventions have to be gender equitable, actively considering and addressing these specific risks and burdens.
So pulling all these threads together, what are the main recommendations coming out of this deep dive? Where should efforts go now?
The clearest recommendation is to keep targeting resources towards those still lacking even basic access. And the data pinpoints them very clearly. The poorest rural populations, especially in Malawi's central and southern regions.
Focus on the furthest behind, geographically and economically.
Exactly. And on the data side, there's a strong recommendation for future surveys.
To get better information.
Yes. To include standardized indicators for the safely managed services, the stricter SDG definitions. We need routine data on water quality, availability, safe disposal of sanitation waste.
So we can move beyond just improved access and really understand who has safe and reliable access.
Precisely. That level of detail is crucial for accurate national estimates and for designing interventions that address the real gaps, not just the ones we could measure easily before.
Okay, so let's recap this deep dive then. Malawi has made some really undeniable progress over 25 years in getting more people access to water and sanitation.
Huge strides, yes. Positive shifts across different regions, wealth groups, education levels. The proportion lacking basic access to water and/or practicing OD was significantly reduced.
But, as we've unpacked, drilling down into the data reveals these persistent, significant inequalities. It's not an even picture.
Not at all. The poorest rural groups, especially in the South, are still facing the biggest challenges. And there are these nuances around urban vulnerability and even surprising gaps among richer households in some specific areas.
Which brings us right back to that SDG mantra, leaving no one behind. It means we can't just rely on national averages.
Absolutely not. Achieving truly equitable, universal access needs that continuous, highly targeted effort, focusing on the lived experiences behind the numbers.
So a final thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. Considering everything we've heard from Malawi, the progress, the persistent gaps, and especially that critical, often invisible role women and girls play, How might really understanding these specific vulnerabilities in this kind of granular detail help us design smarter, more effective, more equitable, and ultimately more sustainable solutions? Not just in Malawi, but in similar places all around the world.